It's a great pleasure to appear before the City Club.
Join us, ask questions, and talk to the people who make New York what it is.
A New York City tradition.
Welcome. I'm Stan Altman, Chairman of the City Club of New York. I want to welcome you to the City Club's Public Policy Forum. The City Club of New York is a 108-year-old civic organization whose mission it is to oversee the operation of the city government to ensure that it is efficient, effective, and responsive to the needs of its citizens. The club carries out this mission through a series of education and advocacy programs. The largest portion of our education activities are, in fact, the public policy forum that you're watching today. One of the issues we take quite seriously as a civic organization that has now been in existence over 3 centuries is to really focus on the transition that takes place within each successive generation to ensure that each generation's leaders are on a position to really get engaged in the civic dilemmas and issues that confront the city of New York. And we try to do that by inviting students from our various schools around the city to come and listen to these forums so that at an early age they begin to understand what the issues that they will confront as they take their place in our society, and hopefully as early in their development as possible as to have them participate, because I think one of the exciting pieces about New York City is there's always something going on. And so it's always our pleasure to invite students and then give them an opportunity just to briefly recognize their presence. First, I'd like to introduce Ms. Talia Maya from the Baruch School of Public Affairs. Ms. Maya is a graduate student in their MPA program. And then from the School of the Physical City, Ms. Kiana Whitfield. And then we're fortunate to have 2 students from Washington Irving High School, Mr. Jason Clark and Ms. Victoria Rivera. And along with them, Ms. Michelle Jarney, who is from the 14th Street Union Square Local Development Corporation. And this is one of those cases where, since education is a really significant issue for the City Club of New York, where public-private partnerships work, where the Local Development Corporation, in a sense, works very closely with the local bid and the school to try to make sure that our students are educated not only in their academic subjects, but in larger issues confronting them as citizens of New York. If there is a subject that is often most misunderstood, and it's the issue of budgeting. There's a tendency to think that budgeting is just a very dry subject, as most of us try to grapple with our annual budgets or paying our bill and trying to live within our own means. And it's often not understood just how much the budget is a template of what really reflects the priorities of decision makers at all levels of government and in corporations. That the allocation of money and where it comes from and how it's spent really reflect a priority of the organization or the entity that the budget applies to. And so it's our delight that on today's forum is to really take a look at the budget not as a series of numbers, but as a story about what it really tells us about the way resources are collected and how they're allocated in the city of New York. I couldn't think of a better person to invite to do this than our speaker today, Dr. Lynne Weikert. Dr. Weikert has had long experience both directly in the budget field as a director of the budget for the New York City Board of Education Special Education Program in the 80s, and then has wide experience in government, having gone to the state as the executive deputy commissioner of the Human Rights Commission in the 80s and early 90s, and then having had her fling at government and the real world, as they often say, decided to enter into an academic career as an associate professor in the School of Public Affairs at Baruch College. That not being exciting enough for her, she decided to then take on the role of executive director of the City Project, and it's in that capacity that I'd like to welcome Dr. Lynne Weikert.
Actually, you took my speech.
I want to see how you do on the
I'm good on my feet. Thank you, everyone, for inviting me here today. Before we get started, let me just tell you a little bit about City Project. It's a small nonprofit. It's like a fiscal watchdog agency that believes in the safety net of government for people who need it. In other words, it's a bunch of liberals. And our work is basically to analyze the city budget, no matter who the mayor is. It's been in existence since 1984. To analyze the city budget and take a look at the fiscal policies of the city, take a look at the management policies of the city, and comment on them. I can honestly say that no mayor has liked us, and that we've managed throughout our short 15, 16-year history of being there, present, saying to mayors, this makes more sense for the residents in New York City than what you've proposed. So we're critics, regardless of who the mayor is. We don't just pick on the current mayor. We picked on the ones before him. And it's in that capacity that I'm here today. However, I am, after many years in government, I am now a professor, and oftentimes I wear that hat. And one of the things I learned as a professor is that I don't particularly like to lecture for 3 hours to students. Begin with, if I were them, I'd fall asleep. And I think that it's not a good way to learn. I think the way you learn is a more interactive approach. So the best I can do here is that I've passed out what I'm going to speak to you today about, and it's on the table. And I'd like you to follow along so that you have a better sense of what we're talking about. And if you don't have a copy, please go get one. So let's turn to the topic, which is about the way we use our city resources. And it's about where our resources come from and about where they go, and about how that's changed over time. But one of the things that I like to talk about with my students is that New York City, as much as we like to think is unique, actually isn't that unique. We actually share many of the problems that other major cities have, because in the end, the city is actually a creature of the state. We're not like the state. We're a city, and because the state has given us permission, we exist. We exist because of a state constitution that says we exist. And that state constitution could be changed tomorrow, and we could lose the charter powers that we have. So that the city operates within a context. It operates within the context of the state, and it operates within the context of the federal government. So before we talk about who wins, who loses, I want to talk a little bit about the context. And as you can see, when you just look at the demographics of our city as compared to the national government, to the nation, what we're dealing with is that the population of the United States has grown over time, continues to grow. We're up almost to 300 million people. And New York City has contracted and has grown again. But compared to the United States, New York City is not growing as quickly as the United States. We're growing more slowly. Now, that's not a bad or a good, and most of this is not about a bad or a good. Most of this is for us to understand what's happening to us as a people in this city. So that, yes, New York City is now growing, but as you can see, it actually, about 1980, it got to one of its lowest points. We were almost below 7 million people, and now we're back up to about 7.5 million people. At the same time that we're growing more slowly than the United States, our non-white population is growing faster here than in other parts of the United States, many other parts of the United States. And our non-white population in this city is now the majority. Not only is our non-white population in the city the majority, it's also now the voting majority. Whereas before, a few years ago, non-white population was the majority in terms of population. Now it has surpassed the white population in terms of registered voters. And then in terms of the per capita income, in terms of the wealth, certainly we all know that the wealth of New York City continues to grow and is growing faster than the rest of the country. But our unemployment is much larger. Our unemployment is usually twice, has been in recent years, usually twice the national average. And while the latest figures I have here are in 1998, where we had 8% unemployment, we now have about 7% unemployment, which is still twice the national average. So while we're growing more slowly than the rest of the country, and the economy, in many ways, reflects more success in other parts of the country where we have much less unemployment. We certainly, however, have success when it comes to the per capita income. And if you take a look at the overhead that Dean Altman's going to put up for us, you will notice, just to talk about the economy a little bit, how striking that economy is over a period of years. One way we measure the health of the economy is simply the number of private sector jobs that exist. And the number of private sector jobs has changed dramatically over the years. And it matches closely the recessions in the national government and the recessions in the city. This city's economy is reflected in the national economy. When the national government has a recession, we've got a recession. And this, in effect, is 3 mayors as we look at it. And Mayor Koch was mayor from '78 through 1989. And during that time, you can see that the economy basically grew, except he had some problems. And he had a problem when he first came in, and then he had a dip in '82. But Mayor Koch basically experienced growth after that, and he had a growing economy to work with. And in '89, in the fall of '89, which is fiscal year 1990, because our fiscal year runs from July 1 to June 30th, in the fall of '89, Mayor Dinkins was elected about the same time that the national economy was crashing, and as the New York City's economy crashed. Ours is always more severe than the national. And the entire time when David Dinkins was in office, you find that the economy was absolutely miserable, both in the national level and in the city. And you can see that long dip down in terms of the loss of private sector jobs. And the loss of private sector jobs, of course, means the loss of an incredible amount in terms of tax revenue. And then you can see at the end of the Dinkins administration, at the beginning of the Giuliani administration, that the increase in the private sector jobs started again. The national economy picked up, therefore the city's economy picked up, we're intricately linked, and it has been growing ever since. And it takes about a year lag between the time that the economy starts to grow again and that revenue starts to hit the coffers that the mayor can draw upon them of the city. But by '96, Mayor Giuliani experienced more and more revenues coming into the city coffers. So you can see the economy and how it affects what our mayors have to deal with. They're either presented with growing budgets or a situation where they have to make some very serious decisions because they don't have enough revenue to match their expenses. And Mayor Koch and Mayor Giuliani basically dealt with a booming economy for most of their years, whereas Mayor Dinkins dealt with a very serious recession. As we go on to what else affects us, if you look at the next chart, we can talk a little bit about intergovernmental aid. And in terms of the intergovernmental aid, that's another place that we're really affected by. So it's the economy that affects the city in terms of our budgets, and it's also what the state and federal government are doing in terms of their aid. And I like this chart. It's a very clever chart. It very basically starts at the bottom right before the fiscal crisis in '75, starts in '72, and moves all the way up to the year 2000. And it shows us federal, state, and local revenues. And the federal aid basically shows that where we used to get about 18% of our budget was in federal dollars, we're now down to about 11% of our budget. The New York City budget is in federal dollars. And this dramatic reduction happened, it happened over time, but there was a dramatic reduction in 1986 that Mayor Koch, I don't think, will ever forget. because that's when he faced a very difficult time, when he lost almost $500 million in federal aid in 1 year. And it was unexpected and very difficult to get through. So that while federal aid as an absolute may be increasing, it's not increasing at the same rate, and we have a smaller proportion of our budget coming from the federal government. It seems to have bottomed out about 11% and is seemed to be fairly stable, about 11% of our budget. The state also has changed dramatically, although not as much. But still, we used to get more than 25, 26% for the fiscal crisis in the 70s. We used to get more than like 25, 26% of our dollars from the state government. And that's dropped down to about 21% of our budget is now from the state government. So as you can see, we're increasingly relying upon ourselves. Whereas before, maybe 57% of our budget was reflected from the dollars we raised, we're now up to much closer to 70%, more like 67% of the dollars we raise is how we pay for our services. And that probably is not going to change for a while. The days when we were increasingly reliant upon federal and state dollars are probably over for a while, and we're increasingly relying upon ourselves. So those are two big picture items in terms of the economy and then in terms of what other levels of government do for us. So now let's look at, in the next chart, which we can put up on the slide, we can just look at the major revenues. And you can see where federal, state, but also our taxes. And we are heavily dependent on our property tax, not as dependent as other localities are, because if you go to a small town, you will discover that property tax probably pays for 80% of the services in a small town. But in our revenue side, we look more like a state, although we don't have the same powers as the state, since we rely on the state to pass our revenues. But we have far more diverse tax structure. But we have a very stable 20, 21, 22% of our monies coming from the property tax. It's a very stable tax. But it's not a lot. Most of it is in other taxes. And those other taxes are a myriad of taxes. I must say that New York City probably has never seen a tax it didn't like at one point or another. We have everything from hotel taxes, utility taxes, commercial rent reduction. It's just amazing, the tax we can think of. Many of them came into being in the mid-'60s during a time of enormous growth in government. And you will find that many of the taxes we're now talking about doing away with occurred during that time. And if you look at the next page, which is not a slide for you to see up here, but we'll talk about it, and that is the whole concept of what taxes are we now cutting. And this is really the heart of what's happening to our revenue. And the heart of what's happening to our revenue is that over the last, I would say, 6 years, we've started cutting taxes. Now, we can't say, leaving aside whether that's a bad or a good, you can't necessarily blame one person for the cut in taxes or to applaud one person the cut of taxes. Because this is something that's happening not just by the mayor's office. It's happening through the city council, it's happening through the state legislature. This is a time of a great many tax cuts. And it's a pattern that exists throughout the country. This isn't something that's happening in New York City alone. And when we look at these tax cuts, the first thing we discover is the greatest tax cut was the commuter tax repeal, which is actually done by the state legislature, and wasn't at all done by the city, and if we had our choice, probably wouldn't have done it. And the reason we wouldn't have done that tax, reduced that tax, is because that tax is an export tax. We like to refer to that as an export tax. We've exported it, and we're charging someone else. Those are the best kinds of taxes to have. We don't have to pay it, somebody else pays it. And in that way, it's too bad that commuter tax was repealed, because it wasn't a tax on those of us who are citizens of the city. It was a tax on people who came in and left every day, and we didn't feel it. But it was $500 million, and we feel that. There's a couple other taxes that were quite large. One is the co-op condo tax, and the other was the expiration of the personal income tax surcharge, and both of those actually were city council initiatives, not the mayor. And they almost total $1 billion. It's enormous. That loss of revenue in the city could indeed come back to haunt us. And the income tax piece was a particularly interesting one because our most progressive tax is the income tax. New York City, to the extent that it has an income tax, has a progressive tax system. And the fact that we tax, progressive meaning that we tax the rich more than we tax those who have very little money. And we consider that and talk about it in terms of vertical equity, which is a fancy way of saying that the rich pay more. So that what has happened is that the city council chose not to continue the surcharge. The mayor said that's fine with him. And we're probably going to go ahead with another piece on that this year. But it's a loss of the progressive nature of our tax structure. In other words, folks like me would rather keep the income tax and sacrifice some other taxes, more targeted business taxes, and keep income taxes. Because in the end, it's a progressive tax. Now, most people will say to me, we just want to get rid of as many taxes as we can. But I don't agree with that at all, because New York City has to offer services. But let's just continue to look at the revenue side a little bit more. The co-op condo tax relief is interesting in itself, because that's mostly a middle-class, upper-class impact, and was initiated by the city council. The other taxes are taxes that were initiated by the mayor. The hotel tax cut was applauded by the entire industry. And there's a debate on whether or not our hotels filled up because the mayor cut the tax, or it was the booming economy that hotels filled up. And you can prove it either way. Social scientists, I think, can be very adept at proving both sides of an argument. I'm sure you could prove it either way. The commercial rent tax reduction was enormous, and it makes a big difference when it was held throughout the city. And for those of you who have businesses, it's a form of a double tax. The commercial rent tax was a double tax. Businesses, when businesses rent, take a lease out on a building, sure enough, they're actually paying taxes because the landlord passes those taxes through to you as leasing that space. But on top of that, and we came up in the 60s with the commercial rent tax, which was another tax on top of that for businesses. It was probably one of the most hated taxes in the city of New York in terms of what businesses thought. And it's soon going to be totally abolished. And what we find is that the mayor has focused on business taxes. He's focused on the hotel tax cut, the commercial rent tax, the unincorporated business tax, and he's also focused on the sales tax, which is, by the way, what we would consider a very regressive tax, because poor people and rich people pay the same thing. So the reason I talk to you about this is that I want you to understand that it's not just the mayor saying, let's have tax cuts. It's a much more complicated picture than that. Whether you're pro-business or whether you're anti-government or pro-government, it's best to understand where all of this is coming from, and it's coming from many different places. New York City is in a difficult situation because it does not pass its own taxes. It must go to the state legislature for approval on everything but the property tax. We have control of the property tax, but we don't have control of the other taxes. So when the mayor wishes to increase a tax or reduce a tax, he's actually proposing to the state legislature. And the state legislature usually goes along. That's why in the commuter tax repeal, you saw the action was at the state level. We don't control our own tax base here. The state legislature controls it, except for the property tax. And I want to talk to you specifically about the property tax, and let's put that slide up. On the next page, this is totally about the property tax. It's a very interesting story, and I stole this material from the Independent Budget Office. And I highly recommend to you that if you want information as objectively as possible, which you won't necessarily get from us, City Project, because we admit to a bias, you can get that from the Independent Budget Office, and they have a website as well. And this talks to you just about the property tax. The property tax has 4 classes. And the first class is the homeowner class. And there you can see that the market value is quite high, whereas the levy, which is another way for burden, is quite low. So you've got a lot of market value in your homes, but the levy, the actual tax burden, is very low. It's no secret that taxes in New York City and homeowners is incredibly low compared to surrounding neighborhoods, the surrounding suburbs. So that's class 1. In class 2 are apartment buildings plus co-ops and condos. So if you're an owner of a co-op or a condo, you're in class 2. And there it looks as if the burden is greater than the market value, which indeed it is. And we haven't yet been able to tease out apartment buildings out of the co-op condo, but the burden is falling for the co-op condo, although you can't really see it here. The third class are the utility companies, and there the burden almost matches the market value. And the last is commercial and industrial property, where the burden is greater than the market value. And so to think through that, an approach City Project has taken, which we would like to see a total rethinking of the tax structure in the city, that in the ideal world, this in effect would become a level playing field, that the market value and the burdens would be somewhat equal in all 4 classes. This is not a popular idea for homeowners in the city. But rather than recommend a particular tax, we would maintain that what we need to do is simply revisit the entire way our city taxes itself. So that, in effect, is the revenue side of this budget. And I think in order for you to understand the expense side of the budget, it's best to take a look at the revenue. So now let's look at the expenditure side of this budget. And there's this wonderful circle that I have here for you, and we can put that up on the projector. And this gives you a very good idea of where all those dollars that we're collecting go. Now, we're talking about a $36 billion budget. 36 billion is 9 zeros after 36. And when I first got my job as budget director of special ed, it was a $1 billion budget. And I never really handled that much. And I was asking a friend of mine, exactly how am I supposed to deal with a $1 billion budget? And he said, it's easy. It's just like a few million, only add a few zeros. And so my first rule of thumb was, don't bother me if it's below $1 million. And I couldn't believe I was saying that to someone. If it's below $1 million, don't bother me. But indeed, you have to do that when you're dealing with that much money. So I don't quite know what mayors say when they look at a $36 billion budget. They probably say, don't bother me if it's less than $100 million. But let's look at the expense side of this budget for a minute. Public safety is 15%. In years past, it was about 10%. It's grown considerably. And public safety is about all of it. It's police, fire, judiciary, the courts, district attorneys, the whole ball of wax. So it's about 15% of our budget. And it's what we call discretionary. Most of the money is tax levy. In other words, it's our taxes. Not that much comes. Some of it does come, but not much of that comes from the federal and state. Education is another great big pot of what I would call discretionary money. There's some federal, there's some state categorical aid, but it's a big pot of discretionary money, and education takes 1/4 of our budget. Now, if you add pensions and debt service to that, because pensions and debt service here are separate, then you're beyond 25, 26%, and you're getting closer to 30. And then we look at social services, which used to be larger than education, is now smaller due to the mayor's cuts in the social services. And it is not discretionary money in many ways. Much of the social services comes from federal and state dollars. And then we look at the environment, the Department of Environmental Preservation, and that indeed is growing. It used to be you couldn't even see the environmental budget in the city's budget in a pie chart like this. And I would say to you it'll continue to grow because some of our problems in the 21st century are going to be environmental. And then you have some other small pieces, pensions being 3.7%, fringes 5.1%, and the debt service here appearing to be 10%, but it's actually growing quite quickly because our infrastructure is in such enormous need that our debt service, basically what this means is this is the interest we pay on our debt. In other words, 1 out of every $10 is going to debt. And shortly, I would say within 2 or 3 years, it's going to be close to 1 in $5 is going to go to debt. Because our debt service is just, is growing because we're borrowing so much money to help us on our infrastructure. So that gives you a general idea of where our dollars are. And for those of you who are like myself, who had children at one point in the public school system, and you wondered why mayors were always attacking the Board of Education, you can see why. If you were the mayor and 1 in $4 was going to education, and it's a discretionary pot of money, what would you do? And you had a problem with a state or a federal government. You would turn to education because that's where so many discretionary dollars are. So it makes it, you begin to see the rationale behind some of this. So let's look and see what our mayors did. And on the next page, and I'll describe it to our audience, our TV audience, let's look and see what Mayor Koch and Mayor Dinkins and Mayor Giuliani have done over the years. First of all 3 of those mayors were after the fiscal crisis. And that basically means that they, in some ways, were much more conservative mayors. It's hard to think of Mayor Koch as a conservative mayor. They're much more conservative mayors than what came before the fiscal crisis. But before the fiscal crisis, we were averaging, in constant dollars, controlling for inflation, 4% growth a year. You would see that in Mayor Lindsay's budgets. You don't see that anymore. No matter what is said about any of these mayors, you don't see that kind of growth anymore. You see much smaller growth. Mayor Koch, the average growth for Mayor Koch was about 1% a year. We're talking about controlling for inflation. The average growth for Dinkins was a little over 1%, and the average growth for Mayor Giuliani is the smallest, is less than 1%. All of them did not spend the way we spent before the fiscal crisis. Now, it's true that Mayor Koch is criticized during the 80s for spending quite a bit and increasing the head count, what we call the head count, the number of government employees. But he also had some very bad years. When he first came in, terrible time, recession in '82, and it balances out to an average of about 1%. But where they put their dollars is very different. And I actually divide the mayors now between what I call growth strategists and what I call redistributive mayors. And I don't really call them that. Other people have called them that, and I stole their terms. But a growth strategist is someone who's very interested in economic development, wants to develop the city's economy and use it as an engine to drive it. And Mayor Koch and Mayor Giuliani were both growth strategists. In some ways, Mayor Koch was a liberal growth strategist. He would love it if I told him that someday. I'm going to tell him. I've categorized him as a liberal growth strategist because Mayor Koch tried very hard to satisfy as many people as he could on his way to growth. And he did it pretty well, actually, for a long time, until people got tired of it. One of the most interesting stories was when, in the paper the other day, when Mayor Koch was at an event, and he looked out in his audience and said, "Do you miss me?" And the whole place cheered. Yes, we miss you. But I'm not going to tell you. But Mayor Koch basically was interested in the developmental side, so he would take the Office of Economic Development, invested in it, and he was not at all interested in what we would call redistributive, taking the dollars from people who do have it and giving it to people who don't have it. And the two largest chunks of services in the city that are redistributive are social services and health and hospitals. The municipal hospital system is used by the poor. Social services go to people in poverty. Those are what are called redistributive services. Mayor Koch did not invest his resources in redistributive services. He wasn't particularly interested. He didn't go after them in a major way, but there's no real investment there. In some ways, we have some services that we think of as neutral. They go to everyone. Anyone can send their children to New York City public schools. Anyone can use the library. We all benefit from public safety, sanitation, and there he invested in most areas. Now we come to Mayor Dinkins, who was not at all a growth strategist. Mayor Dinkins was in a terrible place because of the economy. And he basically was a redistributive mayor. He came in with that as his goal. And indeed, at a time of enormous pressure on him from the economy, he did sink dollars into those redistributed services, like you would expect him to, given that was his commitment when he came into office. Where he wasn't at all interested, he wasn't as interested in a growth strategy. He did not invest in the Office of Economic Development. He would not say to you he didn't care about those things. He would simply was interested in taking what few dollars he had and putting it into where he believed it belonged. And then we come to Mayor Giuliani, who was what I would call a conservative growth strategist, in that he doesn't particularly want to see city government grow. Mayor Koch had no problem with letting government grow. That was fine with him, as long as he could continue to build an engine of economic growth. But Mayor Giuliani is the opposite. He is interested in economic growth, but he's not interested in government growing. And he is not a redistributive mayor. So, of course, redistributive functions have been cut severely. And the Office of Economic Development continued to be increased. Now let's go on and look at some of the major agencies. And this is a fun one because this is all about public safety and social services. And it basically shows us that under 3 mayors, in terms of public safety, we're dealing with a situation where Mayor Koch was pretty committed to public safety, and Mayor Dinkins actually was not particularly committed to putting his resources there, although he's committed to the concept of it, until Safe Cities, Safe Streets came in, and you can see there was more investment in public safety. Whereas Mayor Giuliani, it was no question, and there were resources that poured into public safety. And of course, social services, you can predict who's investing where. And then on the next slide, you will see, indeed, just a reminder of what's happened to people in welfare. And it's important to talk about this, because what we're dealing with here is that most people don't know that one out of every 4 people in this city is actually officially on the poverty or below. 1 out of 4. We have almost 2 million people out of 7.5 million that are poor by the federal government's definition of poor. And we have always had a large concentration of poor people. Just because you take people off of welfare doesn't mean you've gotten rid of the problem. They're still poor. So, but this is just looking at the number of people enrolled in public assistance. And certainly it's clear that under the Koch administration, it hovered about the same about 900,000 throughout. It dramatically increased under David Dinkins, which you would expect given that was his pattern when he came in, and it's dramatically declined under Mayor Giuliani. And Mayor Giuliani probably this year will get below the 600,000 number, whereas under Mayor Dinkins it was over 1 million. And now on the next page you can see the number of children in poverty as compared to the total number of children throughout the city. And in effect, no matter what the mayors have done, we still have a very large chunk of children who are in poverty in this country. There's always been about 600,000 children in poverty in this city, and it has never reached the lows that it reached under Mayor Koch. Our children, there's still a phenomenal number of children in poverty in this city, even though we have a booming economy. And I have to quit soon, but we'll go on to a couple more. One is the whole idea of what's going on with Health and Hospitals Corporation. Our municipal hospital system is basically used for people in poverty. Most people who have health insurance will choose to go to a private hospital, but the municipal hospital system is used by people in poverty in a great manner, and you can see there the enormous cuts that health and hospitals have experienced in this current administration as compared to the others. And the cuts under Mayor Koch reflect the difficult times he had in the economy. And lastly, I just want to show you the Board of Education, which is a favorite of mine because one of the things I study is and participated in is public education. And that is that something unknown, and you'll see in the chart up here, is that the Board of Education actually went very severe cuts during the fiscal crisis, and Mayor Koch rebuilt the Board of Education to a certain extent. And when Mayor Koch left is the time that there was a recession, and therefore Mayor Dinkins started cutting the Board of Education. That's where the discretionary dollars were going. And just recently, Mayor Giuliani continued those cuts. And just recently, Mayor Giuliani has now started to put money back into the public school system. And when he did that, we're now up almost to where we were. So when we say to ourselves, why is so much going into public education? Frankly, if you control for inflation, we're almost back to where we were at its height in '89. I guess let me show you one more piece, and that is the head count, what we call the head count, which is the number of employees in New York City. No mayor has really achieved dramatic reductions in the head count. What Mayor Koch achieved was the growth in the head count. A dramatic growth in the head count was under Mayor Koch. What Mayor Dinkins and Mayor Giuliani achieved was practically a no-growth position. And Mayor Giuliani certainly cut the head count in government in his first few years, but he has now increased it to the point where you find the head count almost backed up to its previous highs, and that will probably continue. So I think I'm getting the high sign that we oh, I can't. We have to look at one more piece. One more piece is that one of the changing picture of what's going on in the city is the way we deal with employees. And that is that one of the ways mayors save money is not to have full-time employees, but to have part-time employees. And one of the ways our mayors are dealing with their fiscal problems are to encourage the number of part-time employees. So whereas before you had maybe 94% of our PS going to full-time employees, it's now down to about 89% of all our salaries going to full-time employees. And in effect, it's dropping as more and more part-time and per diem are being hired, which means that not only does the mayor save in terms of dollars, but they save in terms of the fringe benefits, because part-time workers for the first 18 months receive no fringe benefits. So there's an advantage to the mayors, whether you're Mayor Giuliani or Mayor Dinkins or Mayor Koch, to move away from full-time employees. So I think we'll stop there and we'll take questions. Thank you.
Good. I just want to remind our audience you're watching the City Club of New York's Public Policy Forum. Today's forum is about the city's resources, who wins and who loses, and our speaker is Dr. Lynne Weikert, the Executive Director of City Project and Associate Professor in the School of Public Affairs at Baruch College. First question, please.
Hi, I'm Mark Crawford Levitt. I just wanted to throw out an interesting statistic that I just read the other day, that in Manhattan, 1 out of every 26 people is a lawyer.
Oh.
Whereas in the other boroughs, it tends to be more like 1 out of every 500. I don't know what that really means, but my question...
You're thinking they reside here in Manhattan?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, 1 out of every 26.
It means they're doing
Over
very well.
60,000 lawyers. Practicing or not, I don't know.
Right.
And I plead guilty.
Question.
But the question has to do with, what can we do about this? I mean, we're a municipal corporation. We have a minority of control in the state legislature. Right. We have little or no impact on our national government. And the rich get richer, the poor get poorer. We had a speaker here a few weeks ago for the Campaign for Fiscal Equity about education funding. We have a city which has a Statue of Liberty and is the leader of so many different things in this country, and it's the incubator, the immigration. Well,
Right.
I mean,
what can we do?
What can we do about any of these numbers? We don't have any control.
Well, the point is, frankly, is that we do have some control. And I agree. I think we have to remember we don't have total control. It's better to be realistic about it, so that then you become more strategic about what you're going to do. For example, we put a freeze on the property tax. We did it to ourselves. We took power away from the city council when we put a freeze in the property tax, because it was the only tax we controlled. There's no consideration of taking a look at the property tax and saying, let's try and make it more equitable. Since this is what we control, let's take a look at it. I'm not saying that you should go out and tax homeowners. I'm saying that we should take a look at it. So I think that you have to look at what's in your control and start dealing with it. But I must say that I think it's time that we stopped necessarily arbitrarily cutting taxes. Because when you save, let's say you cut taxes to the tune of $2 billion, which is what we've done as of this year, $2 billion. When the economy stops the good times, we will not be able to provide the services we provide now because we will not have the monies that we could have had if we had kept those taxes. So I think one of the things we can stop doing to ourselves is, where we can, stop cutting taxes. And I know it's an unpopular view, but it's a very essential one, I think, if we're going to balance the city's budget in the future.
What would you do with the extra tax money, Lynn, that you got?
It's interesting because what we can do with the extra tax money in good times, right? We have good times right now. So take the dollars you have now, take even just the surplus, because the surplus is running about $2 billion a year, could very well get up to $3 billion next year. You could take the surplus and you do pay-as-you-go capital, which basically says, let's build some schools, let's renovate some schools, or other pieces. It just doesn't have to be schools. So you can take those extra dollars in good times, instead of going for tax cuts, take those extra dollars in good times and invest them in the city. I would submit to you that other mayors, Mayor Goldsmith of Indianapolis, who's very well known to be someone who believed in cutting government, he took the extra money and invested it in capital construction. He did not necessarily cut an enormous number of taxes. It was a very different strategy than what our mayor is doing right now. And I think Mayor Goldsmith was right. It makes sense. In good times, take your excess and invest it. Don't just go out and put it into next year's budget and save a little bit. Go out and invest it in your infrastructure.
Next question, please.
I live in Lower Manhattan on 6th Avenue near Bleecker Street, and the city has done something absolutely wonderful for me. It created a little park on a playground which was neglected and abused. We have a little Luxembourg Gardens.
Question?
Well, I wanted to say, it's absolutely beautiful with iron gates, with benches. It's closed at night. I would like to know, to whom do we owe it? It I cannot tell who created it, but it saves me a vacation in winter when I sit in Churchill Park, look out into the sun with the sundial, and whom do we owe that? And there's more on 6th Avenue where they have built, outside of the buildings, they have built gardens and viewing gardens.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I must say, Henry Stern would love to get a letter from you.
Okay.
Thank you. Next question, please.
Please, don't walk in front of the camera.
Hi, Anat Jacobson. Can you talk a little bit about funding for programs like Head Start and school-based health centers?
Well, it's interesting. In terms of the Head Start, you're talking about federal dollars. And we could spend it a lot faster than we're spending it, because we've got a surplus in those dollars in terms of Head Start in the city, as we're not spending as fast as we could. But Head Start is one of those programs that works. It's fascinating. There are a number of federal programs that actually are successful. And it isn't the case that federal programs across the board don't work. And Head Start is one of the famous ones where they've done incredible longitudinal studies that have demonstrated that if we create Head Start programs for children, that 20 years later, those kids are still showing the benefits. More kids who go into Head Start are, and this is in a controlled, with a control group, more children who have been through Head Start go to college. More kids who go through Head Start don't drop out of school. Head Start is probably one of the most successful federal government's interventions. And I think that it behooves us to spend the money more wisely than we've been spending it. In terms of the school-based health clinics, is that your second part? Mm-hmm. I'm not familiar with the recent funding about school-based health clinics. I do know they've been very successful where they tried, but I don't know to what extent there's a surplus in it or whether or not they're spending all their dollars.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, I'm Norma Hart. I wanted to ask if in general terms you can think of ways that we can educate the public about the fact that cutting your taxes does mean more money in your pocket, but it also means a reduction in city services, some of which go to you, some of which may go to other people, but without them in the long run, you'll pay more. It's this kind of point that I think emerges from what you're saying, but
Question?
I don't know how we can make it better understood.
Well, what's interesting about the income tax is you deduct local and state taxes from in your deductibles, right?
Yeah.
Assuming that you aren't standardizing. So you're deducting that. So that means that if you don't have that deduction, you're sending that money to the federal government, right? You're increasing your own taxes in effect. So I keep looking at people saying, why are you for reducing the income tax? It's the most progressive tax. You're not really going to win anyway. It's the federal government that wins. Give me a break. Let's keep our income tax. It's the other taxes that may be problematic, not the income tax.
Thank you.
Yeah.
My name's Steve Wilder. On Table 1, you didn't mention in the developmental category transportation, which Koch increased 5.25% a year. Mr. Dinkins dropped it 1% a year. And Mr. Giuliani's dropping it 5.5% a year, even while the subway system since, well, for the last 2 decades has been getting tremendous capital put into it.
That's a good point. Transportation is hard for me to look at when I'm talking about mayors because the mayor doesn't control the transit system. So I have a tendency when I'm just looking at mayors to leave it off the chart because it's not really under their control. But you're right. In effect, Mayor Giuliani doesn't control the subway system. He has some influence over it, but he doesn't control it.
But he took away the school payment.
That's right. That's right.
Is that the 5%?
That's part of the drop, yes. That's part of the drop.
Thank you.
But you're right. If you look at what is a developmental policy, you would include transit. Right.
Next question, please.
Hi, I'm a student at Washington Irving High School. My name is Victoria Rivera.
I had your principal in class, actually. I had him come to class. And,
Mr. Durkin?
yes, and to talk to us what he's doing with the bid.
Yeah.
It was a great class.
I would like to know, since so much of, I was looking at the charts that you handed out, so much money is going into education, yet so many programs have been taken away from us. I remember when I was in junior high school, they had a program of ceramics and pottery, but they had to take those things away. But since so much is going into taxes, why haven't we seen any of those programs put back into the school system.
What's happening in, 3 cheers for that question. What's happening in the schools is basically that the resources are being shifted. We now have universal kindergarten, which we didn't have before. We now are moving toward universal pre-K, which we didn't have before. We have enormous growth in the 80s in special education. We could talk, actually, I could talk about education for a good hour. So basically what's happening in education is that the resources are being shifted. They're being shifted from your athletic programs and your music and arts programs, which never recovered from the fiscal crisis, and they're being shifted into these other areas. And now with the standards being dictated to by the state education department, you find more dollars flowing into basic English, basic math, and retooling and more professional development to retool the teaching staff to teach to those standards.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
I think we're just about to run out of time. Lynn, before we go, since you've mentioned this issue of education, would you be willing to come back here next fall and essentially just concentrate and walk us through what's happened in education?
Yes, very
I want to
much.
remind our audience that you're watching the City Club of New York. Today's forum is about New York City's resources, who wins and who loses in the allocation process. Our speaker is Dr. Lynne Weikert, who is the Executive Director of City Project and Associate Professor in the School of Public Affairs at Baruch College. If you want more information about the City Club of New York, you can get our website and our address at the end of the credits that appear behind the program. I want to thank our audience and our speaker for an exciting and stimulating afternoon. Thank you.